In the Battle of Metz, I made a mistake. I insisted on attacking the city directly instead of going around it. These are the words of General George S. Patton, written in his memoir, War as I Knew It, which was published after his death. Patton was known as a man of action. He was aggressive, confident, and famous for moving fast. He was not someone who often admitted mistakes or apologized. During the war, he believed that speed, boldness, and constant pressure were the keys to victory. But after the fighting ended, when the noise of guns was gone and the war was over, Patton had time to think. In those quiet moments, the memory of the Moselle River and the city of Metz stayed with him. In his memoir, Patton left behind something rare, an honest admission of failure. It reads almost like a confession. The general, who believed wars were won by movement and surprise, admitted that he had ordered his men to attack strong concrete defenses again and again for nearly 3 months. The same man who taught his officers to bypass strong enemy positions and surround them chose instead to launch frontal assaults against one of the most heavily fortified cities in Europe. The Battle of Metz became one of Patton's most costly tactical decisions in World War II. From September to December 1944, during the Lorraine Campaign, Patton's Third Army suffered more than 55,000 casualties. The campaign was meant to push through eastern France and open the road into Germany, but instead it turned into a slow, painful struggle. The city of Metz became the center of this brutal stalemate. German forts surrounded the city, built to survive heavy bombardment and long sieges. Fighting there felt less like modern mobile warfare and more like the trench battles of World War I. It was exactly the kind of grinding, bloody battle that Patton had spent his entire career trying to avoid. This was not simply bad weather, bad luck, or impossible conditions. Patton made decisions. He chose to keep attacking. He allowed his commanders to continue assaults even when it was clear they were failing. He focused on capturing forts and territory instead of protecting his army's strength and mobility. Each choice cost time, momentum, and most importantly, American lives. The real question was never whether Metz could eventually be taken. It was whether capturing it was worth the terrible price. Months of fighting drained the Third Army and slowed its advance when speed mattered most. In the end, Patton himself answered that question. In his memoir, written after the war and published after his sudden death, he admitted the truth. Metz was a mistake, and for a general famous for confidence and pride, that admission may be the strongest judgment of all. By September 1, 1944, General George Patton's Third Army had achieved something incredible. In just 2 weeks, they had advanced nearly 400 miles across France. Town after town was liberated. German forces were retreating, confused and overwhelmed. The American tanks were moving so fast that it felt like nothing could stop them. The German border was now in sight. For those 2 weeks, the Third Army moved like a lightning bolt, fast, powerful, and unstoppable. German commanders were shocked by the speed of the advance. Patton's army did not slow down. They pushed forward every day, always moving, always attacking. Then suddenly, everything changed. The fuel stopped coming. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower made a critical decision. He redirected fuel supplies north to support British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery and his planned offensive, Operation Market Garden. That decision had immediate and painful consequences for Patton. On August 31st, Patton requested 400,000 gallons of fuel to keep his army moving. What he received instead was only 31,000 gallons. It was nowhere near enough. One by one, Third Army tanks began to stop. Engines that had carried soldiers across France sputtered, coughed, and fell silent. Imagine being a tank commander at the front line. Through your binoculars, you can see the German border just ahead. Victory feels close, and then your engine dies. Not because the enemy stopped you, but because there is no fuel left. This was not just a supply problem. It was a crushing loss of momentum. Patton's entire way of fighting depended on speed and movement. His philosophy was simple: keep moving forward, bypass strong enemy positions, break through weak points, and strike before the enemy can react. Without fuel, that philosophy meant nothing. By September 15th, the Third Army was effectively frozen in place. Divisions sat across eastern France with empty fuel tanks. Soldiers waited. Tanks waited. The rapid advance that had terrified German commanders was over. Meanwhile, the fuel that could have kept Patton moving was being sent north to support Montgomery's operation, an operation Patton believed would fail. He warned that stopping his army would waste a rare opportunity to push deep into Germany while the enemy was still weak and disorganized. Eisenhower's decision forced Patton into exactly the kind of warfare he was least suited for. Instead of fast movement and bold attacks, he was now stuck with static front lines, slow and careful advances, and long siege-style battles. Patton was a racehorse built to run, and now, because of empty fuel tanks and high-level decisions, that racehorse was trapped inside a corral, unable to move forward.
Metz was not just another city on the map. It was one of the most heavily fortified places in the world. Taking it was never going to be easy. Around the city stood a massive defensive system made up of 43 forts. These forts were not scattered randomly. They were carefully planned and built in large circular rings around Metz so that any attacking army would be forced to fight through one layer after another. Each fort supported the others, creating a powerful defensive network. The Germans had built these fortifications after they took control of the region in 1871. From the very beginning, Metz was meant to be a fortress city, a shield protecting Germany's western border. Over the years, the defenses were expanded and modernized. The strongest and most dangerous positions, known as the Festung, were constructed between 1909 and 1914. These forts were designed with one purpose in mind: to survive the deadliest weapons of modern warfare. They were built to withstand heavy artillery bombardment and long sieges. The forts were massive structures of reinforced concrete. Their walls were incredibly thick. Beneath the ground, long tunnels connected different parts of each fort, allowing soldiers to move safely without being exposed to enemy fire. Many of the guns were hidden inside armored turrets that could rise to fire and then sink back down for protection. The forts were positioned so their weapons could cover each other, creating overlapping fields of fire that made any attack extremely dangerous. Among all these defenses, Fort Driant stood out as the most powerful. It was the crown jewel of the entire system. Fort Driant was built to dominate the surrounding land and crush any force that tried to approach the city. Its concrete walls were nearly 20 feet thick, making them almost impossible to destroy with the weapons available at the time. For any attacking army, Metz was not just a target, it was a nightmare. It was a fortress designed to stop modern armies in their tracks, and it would soon test Patton's belief that speed and aggression could overcome even the strongest defenses. The gun turrets of the forts were not fixed in place. After firing, they could sink back underground, completely hidden and protected. Long tunnels ran beneath the ground, connecting one fort to another across the entire defensive system. These tunnels allowed German soldiers to move safely, share supplies, and communicate without ever coming into view. American soldiers who fought there never forgot the experience. They described hearing heavy mechanical sounds coming from beneath the earth. First a deep clunk, then a sharp hiss. Suddenly, armored gun turrets would rise out of the ground like monsters. They would fire a deadly volley of shells and then disappear back underground before American artillery could even respond. Many soldiers later said it felt unreal. You were not fighting enemy soldiers you could see. You were fighting the ground itself. The earth seemed alive, attacking and then swallowing the weapons that fired from it. American intelligence made a serious and costly mistake. They badly underestimated the fortress system around Metz. Planners believed these forts were old, outdated leftovers from World War I. They assumed that once the city was surrounded, the forts would quickly surrender. They were wrong in every way. The forts were not abandoned or weak. They were fully manned by experienced German troops who knew exactly how to defend them. The defenders had enough ammunition, food, and supplies to hold out for a long time. They were prepared for a siege. Even more important, the forts were connected by underground communication systems that American artillery could not reach. Messages, orders, and reports moved safely beneath the battlefield, untouched by bombs and shells falling above. What the Americans faced at Metz was not a collection of outdated defenses. It was a living, modern fortress system, carefully designed and expertly defended. And it would prove far more dangerous and stubborn than anyone had expected. October 1944 brought some of the worst weather the region had seen in more than 20 years. The rain did not stop. Day after day, heavy clouds covered the sky, and water fell constantly. Rivers rose higher and higher. The Moselle River overflowed its banks and flooded the surrounding land. Eastern France slowly turned into a swamp. Open fields became deep mud pits. Dirt roads disappeared under flowing water and became small streams. The ground that had been perfect for fast tank movement during the summer was now almost impossible to cross in the autumn. Patton's way of fighting depended heavily on tanks moving freely across open land. His doctrine was built on speed and flexibility. Armored divisions were supposed to leave the roads, cut across fields, and bypass strong enemy positions. Infantry units would secure the roads, while tanks pushed through weak points and attacked from unexpected directions. But in the mud, none of this worked. The mud was not just a physical obstacle, it was like a thief. It pulled boots off soldiers' feet. It clogged weapons and jammed rifles. It soaked uniforms and rotted skin. Men stood and slept in wet clothes for days, their bodies never fully dry. Tanks could no longer move off-road. They sank into the mud and became stuck. Armored units were forced to stay on narrow roads, moving slowly and predictably. Infantry soldiers had it even worse. They advanced through knee-deep water, carrying heavy equipment while exhausted, cold, and soaked to the bone. This was not the fast, powerful, and confident war Patton had promised his men. This was a slow, miserable nightmare. Soldiers shivered in flooded foxholes. Many died in holes filled with icy water, far from warmth, safety, or even a dry place to rest. The terrible weather stripped Patton of his greatest advantages. At the same time, it made German defenses stronger. The fortress system around Metz became even more deadly when attackers were forced to approach along predictable routes through deep mud and flooded ground. In October 1944, the weather itself became an enemy, and it fought against Patton just as hard as the German army did.
General Walton Walker commanded the U.S. 20th Corps under General George Patton. Walker was known as an aggressive and confident commander. He believed strongly in offensive action, and he was convinced that Metz could be taken by a direct attack. On October 3rd, Walker ordered an assault on Fort Driant, one of the strongest forts guarding the city. The attack began under terrible conditions. Soldiers of the 5th Infantry Division were ordered to advance uphill through deep mud toward massive concrete defenses. As the Americans moved forward, German artillery opened fire. Guns from several forts focused their shells on the advancing troops. Explosions tore through the muddy fields. Casualties came almost immediately. Men were hit before they could find cover. Despite heavy losses, some American soldiers managed to reach the outer walls of Fort Driant. That was when they realized how impossible their task was. The walls were enormous, thick, and untouched by the fighting around them. To reach those walls, a single soldier might have to crawl more than 300 yards through open ground under constant fire. After surviving that, he would arrive at a concrete barrier he could not damage.
Grenades were thrown at the fort's 20-foot-thick reinforced bunkers, only to bounce back harmlessly like toys. The Americans tried everything they had. TNT charges were placed against the walls. Satchel charges were carried forward at great personal risk. Artillery fired directly at the fort. But the concrete only burned and blackened. It did not crack. It did not break. It took an extraordinary kind of courage for soldiers to face that reality and still get up the next morning to try again. Many American troops learned the hard way that Fort Driant had been built to survive exactly this kind of attack. The Germans had designed the fort to withstand heavy artillery from World War I, both French and German. By 1944, American artillery was not powerful enough to make a real difference against such defenses. General Walker asked for more resources. He requested additional troops. He asked for more artillery support. He called for combat engineers equipped with special explosives designed to destroy fortifications. These requests were approved, and the reinforcements arrived. And so, despite the losses and the lack of progress, the attacks continued.
Throughout October, General Patton watched as General Walton Walker's attacks failed again and again. Day after day, reports came in from the front. Casualty lists grew longer. Entire divisions were being slowly worn down in front of the forts around Metz. Patton understood what he was seeing. He knew the attacks were not working. In fact, his own military doctrine was very clear on this point. Do not attack strong fortifications directly. Bypass them, move around them. Keep the army moving forward and force the enemy to worry about being surrounded. Metz was exactly the kind of objective Patton normally avoided. It was slow. It was heavily defended. It offered no quick breakthrough. Under normal conditions, Patton would have driven past it without hesitation. But this time, he did not. Instead, Patton gave Walker permission to continue the assaults. He sent reinforcements to the 20th Corps. He committed the 95th Infantry Division to the battle. Even as casualties continued to rise, he ordered the attacks to go on. Patton's decisions were being driven by frustration. He was a commander who believed in speed, movement, and constant pressure. Only weeks earlier, his army had been racing across France. At one point, he was less than 100 miles from the German border. Now, everything had stopped. The fuel shortage meant Patton could not simply bypass Metz and continue his advance. He did not have enough fuel or supplies to support a deep push into Germany. His army was stuck, unable to move forward, unable to maneuver. As Patton watched his men bleed for a single city, he knew that fuel and resources were being sent north to support Montgomery's campaign in Holland. To Patton, it felt like his momentum was being wasted, while others pursued plans he believed were flawed. Trapped by logistics and circumstances, Patton made a choice. He decided that Metz had to be taken. He began to see the city as a necessary stepping stone, something that had to be captured before future operations could continue. Patton believed that once the supply situation improved, Metz would serve as a base for a renewed offensive toward the Saar and deeper into Germany. In his mind, taking the city was not optional. It was a requirement for the next phase of the war. But in making that decision, Patton did something he never intended to do. The man who despised the slow, grinding battles of World War I had unintentionally recreated their worst horrors: static fronts, repeated assaults, high casualties for little ground. And it was a choice that would haunt him long after the fighting ended. October turned into a nightmare for the American troops fighting around Metz. The 5th Infantry Division alone lost nearly 4,000 men. The 95th Infantry Division suffered losses just as heavy. These were not quick, dramatic battles with clear victories or defeats. There were no great breakthroughs. Instead, the divisions were slowly worn down through attrition, one bloody assault after another. Fort Driant still stood. It had not been captured. American troops managed to break into the outer defenses of the fort several times. They fought their way forward with great effort and courage, but they could not hold what they gained. Every time they pushed inside, German soldiers used underground tunnels to launch counterattacks. Suddenly, the enemy would appear from below or from unexpected directions, forcing the Americans to retreat. Again and again, the same pattern repeated. General Walker continued to order attacks. Division commanders followed those orders and kept sending troops forward. Battalion commanders stood by helplessly as their companies were torn apart. They watched soldiers they had trained with, lived with, and fought beside for months disappear into the mud and concrete of the battlefield. Men were wounded, men were killed, others vanished into shell holes and flooded ground, never to return. And through all of this suffering, nothing truly changed. The tactical situation remained the same. The forts were still standing. The defenses were still strong. The cost in lives kept rising, but progress was almost non-existent. October ended not with victory, but with exhaustion, grief, and the heavy knowledge that the battle was going nowhere.
Patton did have another option. He could have bypassed Metz, surrounded it with a small holding force, and continued advancing east. This was his standard doctrine. It was the way he preferred to fight, and it had worked again and again during the campaign across France. But this time, Patton chose a different path. Several important factors pushed him toward continuing the direct assault on the city. First, Patton truly believed that Metz would fall quickly. Intelligence reports repeatedly suggested that the German defenses were weaker than they appeared. Many planners believed the forts were outdated and that the defenders would surrender once pressure was applied. Patton accepted these reports and expected a faster victory. Second, Metz controlled critical railway lines. These rail lines were essential for supplying an army moving deep into Germany. Patton's Third Army was already struggling with logistics. The truck-based Red Ball Express, which had been rushed into service to supply the fast-moving armies, was failing to keep up. Fuel, ammunition, and supplies were arriving too slowly. To continue a major offensive, Patton needed rail transport, and the main rail hub in the region ran directly through Metz. As long as the city remained in German hands, a large and sustained advance into Germany was impossible. Third, and most importantly, Patton did not have enough fuel to advance any farther anyway. Eisenhower had redirected fuel and supplies north to support Montgomery's operations. Without fuel, Patton's army was stuck in place, whether he attacked Metz or bypassed it. Faced with this reality, Patton made a choice. He decided to take Metz while waiting for the supply situation to improve. In his mind, capturing the city would solve multiple problems at once and prepare the way for future operations. The fatal flaw in this decision was a single assumption that Metz could be captured without an unacceptable cost in lives. That assumption would prove to be wrong.
By November, the situation finally began to change. Patton's Third Army started receiving more ammunition and supplies. Fuel shortages eased. Air support also became available, giving the Americans greater firepower and better coordination on the battlefield. Most importantly, combat engineers arrived with specialized equipment designed specifically to attack heavy fortifications. These changes made a real difference. On November 9th, Patton launched a major offensive across the entire front held by the 20th Corps. This time, the attacks were not limited or isolated. Multiple divisions advanced at the same time, applying constant pressure along a wide area. After holding out for nearly 2 months, the German defenders finally began to weaken. The steady bombardment, coordinated assaults, and improved logistics slowly broke their resistance. Fort Driant, the fortress that had resisted American attacks since October, did not fall because of another direct assault. Instead, it was bypassed and contained. Cut off from support and supplies, its garrison could no longer hold out. On December 8th, Fort Driant finally surrendered. The city of Metz itself surrendered earlier on November 22nd. One by one, the remaining forts fell throughout December. The last major holdout, Fort Jeanne d'Arc, surrendered on December 13th. The massive fortress system that had protected Metz for nearly 70 years was finally neutralized. After months of brutal fighting, Patton's Third Army had achieved its objective. But the victory came with a heavy price. The final question remained: was the capture of Metz worth the enormous cost in time, resources, and human lives? Between September and December 1944, Patton's Third Army suffered enormous losses during the Lorraine Campaign. In total, the Army experienced 55,182 combat casualties. These included 6,657 men killed, 36,406 wounded, and 12,119 missing. The fighting was brutal, but that was not the whole story. Non-combat injuries were almost as severe. Soldiers suffered from trench foot, exhaustion, and disease caused by months of cold, wet, and muddy conditions. In some units, the number of men sidelined by these conditions nearly matched the number of men lost in battle. November, with its endless mud and flooding, was especially devastating. The 5th Infantry Division lost nearly 40% of its soldiers. The 95th Infantry Division experienced similar losses. To a general reading a report, these may seem like numbers on a page, but to the men on the line, they were a human catastrophe. By the time Metz finally fell, nearly every second man a soldier had fought alongside in Normandy was either dead, wounded, or lying in a hospital bed suffering from trench foot. Entire companies had been shattered. Units required extensive replacements, retraining, and recovery before they could resume offensive operations. These were not acceptable losses for a strategic victory. They were casualties suffered while capturing a city that, according to military logic, should have been bypassed. Metz offered almost no advantage that could justify such a heavy cost. The Army's offensive power was seriously weakened. Patton's Third Army, once like a fast-moving racehorse, had been slowed and worn down. Divisions that could have been striking deep into Germany instead spent 3 months battering concrete walls. Patton's usual doctrine was designed to avoid this kind of destruction. He preferred to move quickly, bypass strong points, and strike where the enemy was weakest. This approach normally minimized casualties and maintained momentum. At Metz, abandoning that doctrine caused exactly the kind of slow, grinding attrition warfare that Patton had always opposed. The city was finally captured, yes, but the cost had been staggering. The Army had won the battle, but at the price of much of its strength, its speed, and the lives of thousands of soldiers. In his memoir, War as I Knew It, which was published after his death, General George Patton wrote something unusual. He admitted that during the Battle of Metz, he had made a mistake. Specifically, he said that insisting on a direct assault on the city was wrong. Instead, he should have bypassed it and left only enough forces to contain the German defenders. Patton recognized that General Walton Walker, who commanded the 20th Corps, should have been given different orders. He understood that continuing repeated attacks caused far more casualties than the battle was worth. This admission is important because Patton rarely admitted mistakes, especially in public. He was known as a confident, sometimes even arrogant commander who usually trusted his own judgment completely. But in his post-war reflections, Patton clearly saw what Metz had represented. The battle showed how fragile even his bold, aggressive style could be when conditions were against him. The Army had no fuel, which meant tanks could not move freely. The terrible weather turned fields into mud, making armored advances almost impossible. And the German fortress system around Metz was so strong that his normal tactics, speed, surprise, and bypassing strongpoints simply did not work. Yet Patton's problems at Metz were not only caused by difficult circumstances. His error was also in the decisions he made. He chose to continue attacks that were not succeeding. He allowed Walker to repeat tactics that had already failed.
He focused on capturing forts, even though doing so drained his army and caused enormous casualties. The circumstances were already very difficult. Patton's decisions made them worse. He had the opportunity to preserve his army and move forward, but instead he followed a course that caused heavy losses and slow progress. In the end, Patton's own memoir shows that he understood the truth. Metz was a battle where everything that normally made him effective, speed, mobility, and aggressive action, was taken away, and his choices added to the cost.